Henry and Mary Crawford. Why is it that no matter how many times I read Mansfield Park, I still can't quite decide how I feel about them? Were they genuinely heartless, or were they just two people who had no idea what real love actually looks like? It's the greatest paradox of the novel. On one hand, they're easily the most charismatic, quick-witted and entertaining people in the entire story. And I want them in every scene. I want to listen to them talk. But on the other hand, almost everywhere they step, they leave emotional wreckage behind them. The thing about the Crawfords is that they aren't just visiting Northamptonshire for a holiday. Mary is running away from a broken home in London, and Henry, raised by his uncle Admiral Crawford, has grown up in a world where marriage was just a power play or flirtation and used it as a sport. So when they arrive at Mansfield Parsonage, they stay with their half-sister, Mrs. Grant. They bring all of that urban polish and moral emptiness right into a quiet country house. Now, what stands out about them is that they aren't static. Henry's motives actually shift. His tactical play for Fanny Price nearly turns into real redemption when he sees her in Portsmouth and rethinks his whole life at Everingham.
And I will make her happy, Mary. Happier than she has ever yet been herself, or ever seen anybody else.
Mary comes close to choosing something meaningful with Edmund, right up until the final scandal forces her to show who she really is under that charming mask. Whether you look at the book or the screen adaptations, they constantly force us to question where charm ends and self-interest begins. And to understand why they leave such a trail of devastation, I think we have to look at the shadow that was cast by their upbringing long before they ever set foot in Mansfield. The Shadow of Admiral Crawford and Cynical Marriages. In Norfolk, Henry was watching an uncle who treated personal fidelity with complete disregard, showing him that domestic life required no genuine moral commitment. When Mrs. Crawford passed away, Henry was 21 and inherited Everingham and was financially independent. Now that his duties as guardian were over, Admiral Crawford went back to London, took up residence there. It was at that point that the Admiral made a choice that changed Mary's situation. Instead of showing any respect or decency, he immediately brought his mistress into the house to live with them. Mary wasn't naive. She'd grown up around flawed relationships and cynical talk. But in Regency society, an unmarried woman residing in the same house as her uncle's mistress was seriously compromising her reputation and social standing.
He has an estate in Norfolk, but the young lady has recently been forced to quit her uncle's house. Some family difficulty.
She made the decision to leave, choosing to stay with her half-sister, Mrs. Grant, at Mansfield Parsonage. As Austen summarises later in chapter 4, Admiral Crawford was a man of vicious conduct who brought his mistress under his own roof, and Mary was then obliged to leave. Henry, who was fond of his sister and always looking for fresh distractions, decided to accompany her to see her settled and to take a break from the country, which is why both of them arrive at Mansfield together. When you look at those specific environments, both of their motives and attitudes become much clearer. Austen explicitly tells us that Mary had seen no real domestic happiness in her youth, and Henry had grown up with a role model who treated relationships with self-indulgence and complete disregard for propriety. Seeing the marriages around them offered very little example of genuine affection. They saw their uncle's open infidelity. They saw their half-sister, Mrs. Grant, stuck in an uninspiring routine of constantly appeasing Dr. Grant's bad temper and difficult moods just to keep peace in the house. Even Mr. and Mrs. Norris demonstrated a partnership grounded chiefly in financial self-interest and social management. So Austen presents us with two characters who have been brought up to view marriage less as a union of moral respect and quiet affection, and more as a practical arrangement dictated by income, position, and personal advantage. They arrive at Mansfield with an immense amount of elegance and charm, but their expectations of relationships have been shaped entirely by the cynical models of their youth. Flirtation as a sport and society's trap. For Henry, flirting is simply second nature. As a wealthy young man with no profession, he enjoys the admiration of women. When he's around the Bertram sisters, he isn't plotting anything dramatic. He simply enjoys being liked and favoured. Even with Maria engaged to Mr. Rushworth, Henry gives the situation no thought and happily continues flirting as usual. He pays attention to both sisters, flattering them, reading poetry with them, and enjoying their rival attempts to win his favour. During the rehearsals of Lovers' Vows, he enjoys being the centre of their attention. He did not want them to die of love, but with all his heart he desired to be liked, to be missed, to be thought of, to be talked of by both of them. So he wasn't trying to cause a scandal, he simply enjoys female admiration and takes it for granted that his flirting is harmless. Remember that he was brought up by an uncle who carried on in exactly the same way. If that was Henry's role model, then he really had very little hope of developing any sense of moral duty when it came to women. While Henry uses flirtation as a pastime, Mary's view of relationships reflects the world she was inhabiting before she came to Mansfield. With her own fortune, Mary doesn't need to marry for money.
Pity Tom the eldest is not here.
What with his £20,000 and his baronetcy and everything.
Henry, you know those things mean nothing to me.
But her years in London society likely led her to expect that a man's worth naturally led to his public standing, rank, and ambition. When she meets Edmund Bertram, she finds herself genuinely liking him. He's thoughtful, attentive, and gentlemanly. But she encounters a major hurdle when she learns he's prepared to be ordained as a clergyman. Mary is unable to separate the man from his profession. She likes him, that's obvious, but she dislikes his choice of career. To Mary, a clergyman's life means living in a quiet country parish, far removed from the social influence and distinction typical of the London circles that she's used to. A clergyman is nothing. The name is nothing in itself. The influence is nothing. The income, at best, is small, and the occupation, to a man of sense and spirit, must be downright tedious. This is the social trap in which Mary finds herself. Her London background is likely to have accustomed her to value position and ambition so heavily that she struggles to accept a career built on quiet pastoral duty, even when she genuinely likes the man choosing it. So Henry indulges in attention because he enjoys the admiration, while Mary holds back because she can't look past social rank. Both of them are simply acting out of exact habits and standards they grew up with. The Portsmouth strategy and the Everingham potential. There's one brief window where Austen lets us see that Henry might actually be capable of changing for the better. This is quite a turning point for him. When Henry proposes to Fanny Price and she turns him down, Sir Thomas unwittingly sets the stage for Henry to try and prove himself. To Sir Thomas, Henry is a wealthy, attractive match, and Fanny's refusal seems like foolish stubbornness.
I'm half inclined to think, Fanny, that you do not quite know your own feelings.
Instead of forcing her, Sir Thomas decides to teach her a lesson in contrast by sending her back to her childhood home in Portsmouth for an extended visit. Having lived at Mansfield for years, Fanny is returning to a small, noisy, chaotic household where money is tight and order is non-existent. Sir Thomas's calculation is simple. By letting Fanny experience the discomforts of her family's lifestyle, she will better appreciate the security, elegance, and status that marrying Henry would provide. While Fanny is in Portsmouth, Henry takes steps to show a side of him that we haven't seen before. He travels to his estate in Everingham, in Norfolk, to handle his duties as a landlord directly. Instead of leaving his tenants to an agent or ignoring his responsibilities, Henry attends to his estate, fires an untrustworthy agent, and steps in to protect the tenant who was being mistreated. Austen shows us the direct impact this has on Fanny in Volume 3, Chapter 12. He had restored a poor man to his rights. He had done a generous, a just, and kindly thing. Fanny could not have helped believing that he must have a better heart than she had been used to give him credit for. So Austen uses this moment to show us a crucial what if. Henry isn't incapable of doing good. When he applies himself to useful duty, he has the intelligence and capacity to be a responsible man. So when Henry later visits Fanny in Portsmouth, the contrast between his polished manners and her family's noisy environment is stark. But Henry doesn't act superior or look down on her family. He treats her father with respect, takes her brother William under his wing, and behaves with genuine consideration and quiet attentiveness. For the first time, Fanny's absolute certainty about his character wavers, and she begins to see that he might genuinely be capable of improvement. But Austen doesn't let him off lightly. When Henry leaves Portsmouth, he goes to London, where his sister Mary is staying, and she's staying with the Rushworths in their rented house for the social season. Henry doesn't arrive planning an affair. In fact, he tells Mary that he's still devoted to Fanny and intends to return to his own estate. The turning point is pure toxic ego. When he meets Maria in her new home, she gives him a cold, dismissive shoulder to punish him for abandoning her at Mansfield.
For shall I tell you how he was received? Yes, very coldly.
Henry's vanity simply can't handle being snubbed by a woman who used to worship him. Austen tells us in Volume 3, Chapter 17, he saw Mrs. Rushworth, was received by her with a coldness which mortified him, and could not forgive her for being force-proof against his attractions. Curiosity and vanity were both engaged, and the temptation of immediate pleasure was too strong for a mind unused to make any sacrifices to right. She then goes on to say, in his spirit he began the attack, and by animated perseverance had soon re-established the sort of familiar intercourse of gallantry, of flirtation, which bounded his views. So Henry tells himself that he'll just flirt enough to conquer her pride and win back her admiration, believing he can control the game. Instead, he plays with fire, gets sucked right back into their old dynamic, and the situation spirals into full-blown adultery and total social ruin.
I cannot. Oh, my dear one.
News of the affair breaks via the London newspapers, probably the Regency gossip section, sending shockwaves back to Mansfield. And so that Portsmouth visit is the last time we ever see Henry in person in the book. In the final chapter, Austen steps back as narrator to deliver her ultimate scathing verdict on him. That punishment, the severity of which should have been proportional to his sense of it, he had chosen for himself. He had left the girl he loved for the woman he cared nothing about, and found himself completely foolish and miserable. Austen makes sure that we know that Henry is left bitterly regretting what he threw away, knowing that if he had just stayed at Everingham or waited patiently for Fanny, he could have had real happiness. Instead, he spent the rest of his life shut out from Mansfield, tied to the scandal, and suffering the exact consequences of his own vanity. Beneath the London sparkle, the calculation of Mary Crawford. Mary Crawford is perhaps the most vibrant, charming character in Mansfield Park. But beneath all of that London sparkle, she's driven by cool, deliberate social calculation. Unlike Henry, whose downfall comes from physical impulse and vanity, Mary operates through intellect and strategy. What makes her fascinating is how seamlessly her warmth and wit obscure her motives. Mary is constantly and quietly operating behind the scenes to shape her own social environment. We see this strategic mind at work in how she approaches Fanny Price. When Mary gifts Fanny an amber necklace before her first ball, It appears to be a warm, sisterly gesture, yet given how actively Mary encourages Henry's interest in Fanny, it's easy to view this gift as a subtle effort to draw Fanny into the Crawford orbit and make her more receptive to Henry.
Choose one and oblige me.
Oh, no, Miss Crawford.
I believe is the prettiest. Will you accept it from me?
If it is your wish.
Mary uses this charm as a tool, treating relationships as connections to be cultivated and managed. Mary also challenges Edmund's chosen career. She finds the idea of a humble country vicarage unappealing, and so she uses her charm and social prestige to push Edmund towards a higher status life in London.
So, you are to be a clergyman, Mr. Bertram. This is rather a surprise to me.
Her frustration isn't necessarily rooted in malice, but in a conflict of values. She finds Edmund attractive and compelling, yet his lack of worldly ambition completely stalls her interest.
You can assign greater consequence to clergymen than I am used to hear. One scarcely sees a clergyman out of his pulpit.
The major crack in her polished mask appears when Tom Bertram falls dangerously ill. While others view his near-fatal illness as a tragedy, Mary's letters from London reveal a very different focus. She immediately recognises that if Tom dies, Edmund inherits the title, the estate, and the fortune. To have such a fine estate in possession, I really believe I should begin to think of the family compact. Now, by family compact, Austen means a formal marriage alliance between their families. This line exposes Mary's fundamental outlook. While she has genuine affection for Edmund, we think, his value as a prospective partner rises dramatically the moment the fortune enters the equation. Her ultimate miscalculation, however, comes during the final scandal when Henry and Maria run off together. Mary's primary impulse isn't moral shock or personal grief, it's public relations. She treats the affair as a tactical blunder rather than a moral failure.
What I advise is that your father be quiet. Persuade him to let everything take its course.
Believing that if Henry and Maria simply marry, host lavish London parties and brazen it out, high society will eventually move on.
We must bring about a marriage. We must persuade Henry to marry her, and I do not despair of it. Fanny, he must give up.
In attempting to manage the scandal as a minor PR inconvenience, Mary reveals a total absence of moral concern. She assumes Edmund shares her pragmatic cynicism, failing to realise that her attempt to smooth over the scandal is the exact thing that alienates him forever.
I do not know you, and I'm sorry to say I have no wish to.
Austen ends Mary's story not with a dramatic punishment, but with a quiet, lifelong compromise. Returning to London, Mary finds herself unable to replace what she lost in Edmund. The wealthy men in her fashionable circle lack his integrity, while the men of character lack the fortune that she demands. In the end, Mary's cynicism leaves her trapped in the very shallow world that she thought she was so clever to navigate. Screen adaptations, reimagining the Crawfords. Translating Mansfield Park to the screen, and I've said this time and time again, presents a unique hurdle for filmmakers, particularly when it comes to Henry and Mary Crawford. On page, the Crawfords operate through subtle social grace, wit, and charm. But cinema relies on visual shorthand, and directors often struggle to convey the threat that hides behind their manners. When you place the three major screen adaptations side by side, you see three completely different strategies for handling Austen's most magnetic brother and sister. The 1983 BBC miniseries takes the most faithful approach, adhering closely to the novel's dialogue and pacing. Because it has the runtime to breathe, it allows the Crawfords to operate as Austen wrote them, polite, engaging, genuinely likeable on the surface. However, because it mirrors the text so strictly, the production can feel stagey, to modern viewers, relying almost entirely on the actor's spoken lines to convey the subtle tension beneath the polite front. The 1999 film takes the exact opposite route, drastically reshaping the material for a modern audience. Here the Crawfords are heightened to make their intentions immediately obvious on screen. Mary is rendered as a sharp, openly pragmatic opportunist who treats social status like a competitive sport, while Henry is framed as a dark, more traditionally seductive figure. While this version strips away much of Austen's subtlety, it succeeds actually in highlighting the raw, competitive edge of their London mindset, making their threat feel immediate and cinematic. The 2007 ITV adaptation sits in a rushed middle ground. With a heavily compressed runtime, it lacks the space to develop the Crawfords' gradual integration into Mansfield Park society. As a result, Henry and Mary are forced to move quickly through their character beats, often making their actions feel abrupt. Yet this brevity unintentionally highlights just how reliant the Crawfords are on momentum. Without the slow build of their charm, their motives appear far more obvious, showing how easily Austen's delicate balance can collapse when stripped of context. Looking at all three versions together reveals the fundamental challenge of adapting the Crawfords. The 83 version shows us how they sounded. The 99 film shows us how their cynicism feels to modern viewers. And the 2007 version demonstrates what happens when their charm is stripped away of time and patience. Each adaptation captures a fragment of their identity, but it's only in Austen's original text that their charm and their calculation exist in complete, dangerous balance. And I suppose out of all adaptations of Austen's books, the viewing audience are probably still waiting for a decent, well-paced adaptation that brings Mansfield Park to life, focusing on what Austen wrote instead of trying to create a romance film. Every major attempt at Mansfield Park tries to bend it into a standard breezy Regency romance, like Pride and Prejudice or Emma. But Mansfield Park isn't built like these books. It's a quieter, darker, and more psychological study of character and morality. When directors try to turn it into high-energy romantic comedy, they end up fighting against Austen's actual story. Mansfield Park occupies such a strange, isolated position in Regency screen adaptations. Take the Bronte sisters, for instance. They get the dark, atmospheric treatment because their Gothic influence is overt. The windswept moors, Rochester's attic, Heathcliff's obsessive melancholy. Filmmakers know exactly which visual and tonal draw to open for Wuthering Heights or Jane Eyre. With Austen, directors almost reflexively pull from the top drawer that's filled with bright sunlit drawing rooms, witty banter and happy endings. But of course, Mansfield Park is a psychological pressure cooker. Its darkness isn't supernatural or gothic, it's domestic, quiet and institutional. It's about emotional neglect, moral erosion and social coercion, and that claustrophobia of living in a home where virtue is preached but rarely practiced. Because modern directors struggle to sell the quiet psychological drama set in the Regency period without relying on standard rom-com tropes or aggressive contemporary stylistic choices, whether that's modern meta commentary or heavy-handed casting concepts that pull focus from the text's specific historical and social mechanics, they miss the actual tension of the novel. Mansfield Park doesn't need to be turned into a gothic horror or a breezy romance. It simply needs a filmmaker brave enough to let the quiet psychological threat of the Crawfords and the cold hypocrisy of Sir Thomas Bertram breathe on screen exactly as Austen wrote them. Austen's verdict on the Crawfords. So to conclude, when you look at Mansfield Park as a whole, it feels as though Austen introduced Henry and Mary Crawford as a stress test for everyone around them. Their charm, intellect, and social grace act as a mirror, exposing the vulnerabilities and moral shortcomings of the Bertram household. Structurally, the Crawfords bring movement to the novel. Mansfield Park on its own is quite rigid and physically still. But Henry and Mary bring energy, conversation, and wit that push the story forward. It seems likely that Austen made them so engaging because she wanted us as readers to experience the very same charm that draws in Fanny and Edmund. We're meant to enjoy their presence, appreciate their quick wit, and perhaps hope for their better instincts to win out. That's what makes their final trajectory so compelling. They recognise genuine goodness in Fanny and Edmund, they touch it, and for a time they're genuinely drawn to it. Yet ultimately they turn away from it. Henry chooses a moment of vanity over a life of quiet devotion with Fanny. Mary chooses social self-preservation and financial ambition over a genuine connection with Edmund. It appears they fail not from a lack of intelligence or opportunity, but because they are products of a world that taught them to value social standing over personal integrity. At the end of the novel, Austen leaves both characters facing the quiet reality of their choices. Henry is left to process the self-inflicted ruin of his reputation, knowing what he sacrificed for a fleeting impulse. Mary remains caught in her old dilemma, unable to find a partner who combines the integrity she saw in Edmund with the wealth she feels she requires. In the end, we're left with two figures who had every advantage of intellect and charm, but whose cynicism ultimately kept them from the very happiness that they sought. So when you read Mansfield Park or watch any of the adaptations, do you yourself find yourself wishing that Henry and Mary made different choices? I know that many readers feel Henry was actually on the path to changing his ways, and that he might have been a much better match for Fanny than Edmund if he had changed. And out of the three screen adaptations, which portrayal of the Crawfords do you think came closest to capturing their complexity from the novel? So that's it. That's a little look on Mary and Henry Crawford for you. So for now, I'll leave the floor open to you. Give me your thoughts on the Crawfords. Were they just victims of their upbringing and therefore they couldn't change? Or were they so close to changing but then chose not to? I think that's how Austen gave them to us. Catch you in that next video. Bye for now.